What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about Bloodlines 2, a topic we have not talked about in some time. I believe the last time I made a dedicated video on the matter was in fact back in February, but I would say since around August or so they've been throwing out some information that I thought was interesting individually but not really worth making a video on, and then finally at the end of October they actually dropped a new trailer for the game as well, alongside a few other interviews and things during October that also shed some light on a few details that I finally decided were worth discussing, and thus here we are. Now I'm going to try to get to the most important bits right here at the beginning, and honestly feel free to just listen if you want to. I'm going to show off some of that new trailer, of course, but realistically there's not too much to see outside of what's already been shown for quite some time. But with that said, let's talk about it. Now, as is already well known, back in August I believe it was, they delayed Bloodlines 2 to the first half of 2025, basically stating that the game is pretty well done, they just wanted extra time to polish it, and given the shoes they're trying to fill, probably for the best, I would say. And they've been very communicative with dev diaries and everything since, so that seems to line up with reality. And we'll get into some of those dev diaries here in just a moment. Now, personally, Bloodlines 2 is a game I was hoping to play in 2024 after all the delays, naturally, but honestly not a huge deal to see it get pushed out. However, what was much more concerning and leads into, I would say, bigger topic I want to speak about for a moment is an interview with the CEO of Paradox that happened somewhere towards the beginning of October, in which it was outright stated that even if Bloodlines 2 is successful, and they certainly hope it is, they will not be developing a third one just because of the headache that it caused. In fact, they went so far as to say that if there is a third one, it will be made by somebody else, purely via a licensing agreement. Now, I wanted to mention that for a few reasons, specifically because A, I think it's just wild that a CEO would ever say anything like that publicly, especially when you're dealing with a game that's already had as troubled a development as Bloodlines 2. To say that instills less than confidence would be a gigantic understatement, especially for a product that's really only supposed to be undergoing polish at the moment. But the main reason I bring that up was to simply lead into my own thoughts on Bloodlines 2, especially following some of this information and what we're about to share, of course. Now, speaking for me, I would say that you would have to be naive to expect this to turn into a truly great time. Now, I'm hoping Bloodlines 2 manages to be good, because honestly, with everything else going on with this game, that in and of itself would be a small miracle. One thing I am pretty certain of, though, is that another reason I think this game would be hard-pressed to live up to the name of its predecessor is simply the time that has passed since then and what a flash in the pan that original game was anyway. The original Bloodlines is one of my personal favorite titles. I love that game. I have it installed on my computer right now. And to put it relatively simply, I would say the time since that game was made, and as well as all the cultural shifts and everything that have happened over the years, means that you just aren't going to be able to capture exactly what it was that worked about that game. So if you're expecting a sequel to that original title in that exact same vein and that mood and everything, I just don't think you'll be able to do it. And speaking as someone who loves that game myself, nothing from what I've seen and what they've shown of Bloodlines 2 really instills me with confidence that this will be as loved as that original title. But to be fair, the original wasn't loved on release either. It simply gained a cult following over the years. So even if this game gets an extremely poor release, I don't think that would be outrageous or anything given the circumstances. So to put it simply, hoping for the best, preparing for the worst. Now, other things I wanted to talk about in this video, though, are some of the systems they've shown off since August as well, because while the 2000s are certainly in the past, game design and technology have certainly marched forward, and at least some of the systems they've described here sound pretty interesting, and so I wanted to talk about them a little bit. Now, one of the dev diaries they put out focused on dialogue and how it would change and be affected by your conversations. And they've talked about it and shown some of the system that they plan on implementing, or have implemented, I suppose, into the game in order to afford both a very aggressive option to showcase the fact that our character Fire is meant to be an elder, or a manner of speaking that's more about simply buttering someone up, so to speak. And they also point out that, what's best in any given situation isn't necessarily one or the other. You might have to, take into stock who you're talking to and adjust accordingly. Now, broadly speaking, your response to any given situation will be one of those two extremes and then a place in the middle ground. They also mention there will be more dialogue options than just those three options in cases where it makes sense, of course, but that's the general premise. And then they also showcase a few cases of a conversation changing based on how the vampire you are speaking to reacts to the way you have spoken to them, which will lead to these individual characters having some manner of affinity towards you while also maintaining some of that mystery surrounding what vampires are all about these days, which is an interesting enough concept, but of course actually managing to pull that off across an entire game is up for debate, let's say. Now, another one of their dev diaries that I thought was really interesting was about Seattle, and then they followed that up with blood resonance and feeding and everything. Now, this game does take place in Seattle, of course, and actually one thing we know more than just about anything else in the game is the setting and the atmosphere, because they've shown off quite a bit of it via art and whatnot, and just the Chinese room, the developers' previous experience with games, I would say certainly points to them being able to capture the atmosphere of a vampire game very, very well. In fact, the part of this that I am the least concerned about is that aspect of it. I think the visual state of the world and how that blends into the gameplay is probably going to be fine. If not pretty good, actually. And we can kind of see that in some of the concept art they've released of the city and how things look and how they showcase the various social classes alongside the vampires. But one thing I thought was really interesting is that they talk about where you fit into that and how they've adjusted and exaggerated certain aspects of it in order for it to make more sense through the eyes of a vampire. For instance, and they go into this very specifically, they want the city to feel oppressive at times, and they did that by quite literally making some of the buildings larger than they would actually be, with the idea that some of the skyscrapers that you'd be walking past and around make up sort of tree trunks to envision a sort of, urban jungle type thing. But then, of course, there's the grimy alleyways and dirty streets that you'll actually be traversing on foot and introducing yourself to people and meeting them in, which is important because it seems like talking to even regular citizens will come up a fair bit. And that's where blood resonance comes in. One of their most recent dev diaries, in fact, goes into blood resonance and unlocking abilities for our character over the course of a playthrough depending on our clan. Now, this is, in part, I would say, V5 Vampire the Masquerade mechanics, put into a video game, but blood resonance basically means the state of the blood your character is feeding on, having an effect on you, of course. Now, the three blood resonance we'll encounter are melancholic, sanguine, or choleric. And in order to get a person's blood fully resonated, we, as the vampire, have to interact with them. And this is what we'll be doing on the street level and things when we're exploring, and we need blood. Basically, we'll be able to walk up to citizens, figure out what we need to do to resonate their blood with one of those different types of resonances. That is to say that if you want them to be scared of you, that is to say melancholic, you'll need to, of course, be terrifying. Or if you want them to be angry or annoyed, you need to, do something to facilitate that. And then, of course, other less than, let's say, YouTube-friendly options. And then once that blood is resonated, then you would feed on them to gain the appropriate benefit. But, and I thought this was especially interesting, that's not the only way. There will actually be events and stuff happening around the city, apparently, during which, because of those situations, that person will already be in a fully resonated state, meaning that your character doesn't need to do anything extra besides simply feed on them. And then, of course, you have to do all of that while maintaining the masquerade in places where it is required, as that's a pretty core piece of the setting itself. But we're not done yet, because then we get into our abilities. You see, we're not just collecting this blood for fun, we're going to be using it to fuel our vampire powers. And it's also how we're going to unlock new ones. Now, our character will be able to pick one of 4 different clans, and your clan will have abilities associated with it, and it will be easiest to unlock the abilities for your clan. I imagine that just means it'll be cheaper resource-wise. And then with that resonance, as well as the help of some clan contacts, you'll be able to unlock abilities from the other disciplines as well. This is meant to represent our character, Fire, regaining their abilities from torpor, as we of course awoke in a weakened state. And they go on to talk about how you will of course be able to mix and match some of these abilities to hopefully find some interesting combinations. And they even show off some of what using our heightened senses to check for both resonances as well as other supernatural creatures will look like, especially since not every kindred or vampire feeds in the exact same way, and you might just run into them also trying to feed and have to contend with that as well. So all of these things together, I would say, don't necessarily answer every question I had, but I thought made up enough interesting info to actually make a video on and cover, which is obviously what we're doing here. But hopefully all of that was of some interest to you. I think they've finally been dropping some interesting information as we lead up to 2025, and of course whenever they actually release this thing, since it's apparently mostly done. Now, with that in mind, the rest of this year should be quiet for information on this particular game. It looks like most of their upcoming planned dev diaries are centered around sound design especially, so I imagine the next time I'll cover this one will likely be in the new year. But nonetheless, as always, good or bad, I'm following this one along for the ride and we're going to see what happens with it. But either way, that is going to do it for me today, so I certainly hope you enjoyed this video, found it informative. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.